Hello and welcome back to the program. My name is Michael Finney. Today, I am joined by BLAC.ai. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly, sir?
Michael, what's up, man? Super happy to be here. Appreciate you having me on. The short version is I'm a bit of a traditional artist, and I have been for a long time. But here in this world of things, I've kind of adopted to collaborating with AI and have kind of pushed that in the community of things here. And so, kind of started in this space specifically in May or so of 22. But I started working with AI long before that, kind of late 21. On my own, sort of in a silo, built my own AI proprietary program and kind of worked with that sort of out on an island, so to speak, until I realized that a bunch of other people were making amazing things as well, utilizing this stuff. And ever since then, it's just been kind of a crazy roller coaster of things. And from being exhibited internationally to different countries and being able to work with a lot of these companies, even doing like beta testing and things like this, it's just been sort of a wild ride. So as far as my art life of things, this is definitely where it sort of popped off. I've been working in creative teams and running like agency marketing type of work as far as my career goes, and so I've been in the sort of creative field of things. But as far as like flexing on art specifically, this is the first time in my life I've done that in a more professional type of manner, and it's been wild. So
yeah, I love it, man. Your arc has been fantastic to watch, and as someone who's kind of newer to what you have been producing, inside of the AI scene online, you have a very distinct style and character. But I want to ask, where that came from in regards to your traditional background. How did you get started? Where did you train? What should people know?
So, my traditional background is I started, doing art as a kid and did a lot of illustration, and then got into painting. In high school, I took sort of like advanced, art classes and things like this. And then eventually I went to Savannah College of Art and Design. I did more, I kind of started there with one intention and left with another. I didn't want to be a struggling artist. so I ended up kind of going into advertising and marketing direction after experiencing a lot of other things there. And then, this sort of career of things that I've done, I've sort of accumulated all those into one big package that I use here. So I've been a photography director, creative director, marketing director. I've worked in different startups. I've ran a couple of agencies and worked with a lot of startups, as far as the consulting side of things go, and kind of helping people build businesses and build things. That's sort of what I do. I've been involved in running 5 different businesses since, I think my first one was when I was 19, and, some successful, some failures, which is sort of how the story goes. And, right. In the meantime, I've just learned a lot. And so I've always been someone who just personally explores art, even though I've done all these other things professionally. I love doing photography, and that's been like a huge influence for me here in a lot of the things that I work on and the work that I produce. But as far as other mediums, I've been an abstract expressionist painter for a long time, since high school. Most of my things are abstract expressionist style of works. And so when I first got into the AI side of things, and working with, as I said before, I had created with a developer's help, I had created a proprietary AI program. And the result of those things were very expressionist in nature. And so a lot of that really turned me on to the whole thing, because it was almost like working with a different type of canvas and kind of getting that almost like artificial expressionism type of vibe to it. And so that was sort of how I started in this. And then since then, as far as how that has directed the persona of things, I believe in art, and I believe in people expressing themselves. I think a lot of people who were here last year, starting into the whole AI thing, we caught a lot of flack for doing that from outside communities and things like this. And so I feel like there's been almost like a bond created out of struggle, and I'm someone who has a hard time staying silent about things that I believe in, and I just want to stand up and say them. And I did that a lot last year and earlier this year, and I think that now things have sort of settled down, and I just create the things that I want to create. And so that has led me into just really getting super deep into the work that I've been creating and the things that I've been focused on, more so than anything. And all that is sort of driving factor for, who I am in the space, I would guess to say.
fair points that you make. And I think that we have actually talked in the past about an experience that I had earlier this year with an event that is local to me for the Comic-Con scene, where they were very vocal about banning AI art and potentially, removing vendors who were selling AI art within their venue. And that, to me, I raised the point to them. I'm like, that's heinous and wrong. And also, are you going to do that for people that are using Photoshop? And at that point, Photoshop had not launched their generative component yet. And here we are, looking at Photoshop and Adobe getting in on the act too. And I think it's going to be really, really tough for a lot of these, quote unquote traditionalists to, carry that flag going forward. I want to ask you, what are some of the more interesting or compelling aspects of your professional experience as it relates to your creative acts or your passion for being creative and an artist?
I think one of the things that has really kind of propelled me with that sense of mind was right after Stable Diffusion released last year, and I started working with it, and I finally got into this groove of, photorealism. And I think at the time that was actually pretty difficult to achieve, even with Stable Diffusion. And it was the first time it was even, possible. I think it was really tough. And I remember I had a conversation with another, somewhat prominent artist in the space, and we were talking about maybe collaborating or whatever else. And I sat down and I spent like 2 hours, prompting out new things. And I was getting some crazy, it looked like I had stepped out into 10 different photo shoots, and, coordinated wardrobe for weeks, and, created all these different lighting structures and done all this stuff that I've done before in like 2 hours with no budget. And that to me was like one of the things that was really just like super impactful and kind of game changing with the way that I looked at it, because I was like, wow, like I can actually conceptualize an entire photo shoot, if not many of them, in an hour versus months of preparation or huge budgets or things like this. And it can be absolutely crazy. It can be things that are unreal but look real. And that to me was sort of a turning point mentally, where I started realizing the potential of these things, as well as seeing the huge the difference between where it had been just earlier in the year to, I think, Stable Diffusion released in August of last year. From when I started working with it in December or so of 21, December, January, to when Stable Diffusion came out, it was leaps and bounds beyond that. And I realized with that contrast what type of future we might end up having, because seeing the photorealism happen in the way that it was happening for me, I was blown away by the future potential, like where that was going. If we made that kind of stride in 7 months, what's it going to look like in 7 years? Because it was something that was inconceivable at the time before that. And so to me, I take that same perspective and I apply that to a lot of things, like when ChatGPT came out or all these different AI tools we see all the time. My initial thought is, especially with the brand new things, I'm like, well, that's V1. What's V5 going to be? What's V10 going to be? Because we've seen this crazy growth. And so I look at it as this really crazy kind of wild west of things. And the potential is just sort of unlimited, so a lot of that really affects, the way that I look at it.
I like it. As the technology has evolved, let's say over the last 2 years, as you've been working with it, how has that informed your developmental process and your creative process in any angles that you'd like to approach that from?
At first, it was experimental and exploratory, like I think a lot of things are. And I think that at first, like, let's roll the clocks back a year from right now, in September of last year. I think there was a lot of skill in prompting. I think there was a lot of skill in how you worked with these tools, and not necessarily what they were doing, but more so how you worked with them. And so I think that, and I'm looking at a lot of the growth in the way that these tools function, especially, Midjourney, I think more so than anything else, like, the ease of use there. And it's something that I think as mass adoption kind of occurs with this stuff, what ends up happening is that the identity of the artist becomes very important in terms of and by identity, in this case, I'm referring to their process and the way that they're working with it and their overall sort of world in which it is that they're building. And so I think that's really important because the how is becoming less and less important than the why. And that's something I said that last year as a lot of these tools were coming out. I feel that 100 times more than I did then right now, because anybody can create anything. And with that, it's almost like having a cheat code, to a video game. You go into like God mode or something, and then it's really fun for like an hour. Then you're like, yeah, whatever. There's no challenge anymore. So it's like, it doesn't really, like, nothing matters if you can do anything. How you play the game doesn't matter if anything can happen or if nothing bad can happen, So it's like, not that there's good and bad in this situation, but I look at it as like what's valuable and what's not valuable. So I look at it as when you see all these different tools come out and you're able to do all these different things, to me now it's less about being experimental, less about being exploratory, and more about defining what it is you want to achieve, the story you want to tell, the emotions you want to express, the thoughts you want to invoke through this work, and then going into it with that intention. I believe that art is intentional expression, regardless of the outcome or what tools are used or anything else. That's sort of a definition I've come up with and sort of refined here over the last year while trying to understand what defines art and what doesn't. I think you can go into these things and play around and create images. Is that art? If it's not intentionally done with that in mind, no. Anything intentionally created to be art is by definition art in my mind. I think it just depends on your intention as you go in and work with these things and the thing that you're trying to build with it, like what that actual intention is and whether or not you hit a goal that is either met or like if you meet that goal or you come to a new understanding of that goal utilizing the collaborative process and you come to this this sort of like end result that resembles the intention or elevates it. So that's how I kind of would describe that.
That's fair. And I want to drill down into this in regards to the artist incubator that you operate or manage, cultivate. I suppose all of those things are fair. It revolves around creating art, but also critiquing and speaking about that. What are you getting out of managing that group? And maybe what are some of the things that members are getting out of that?
Yeah, so this is something that we started in like February, March or so. And I wanted to create something like it. And I thought that there was room for some educational type of environment, if you will, around the idea of getting feedback and having valuable critique sessions and things like this. And coming from the environments that I've been in, working in creative teams and going through like art school and stuff like this, like you go through a lot of critiques and that's how you get better at what you do. And so on Twitter, it's a little bit different because you post something and if people like it, they go, cool piece, bro, when meant. And it doesn't really add any value or feedback. And plus it's almost like you're putting something out there that's finished and people don't want to be critical of it or give, additive feedback in some way. And so I started it just really for that. And it's not something that to be honest, I really don't even talk about very much because the group we have in there is great. We've got just over like 300 people or so. And, I'd say a decent, maybe, 10% or so show up every week and we do sort of like live critiques and stuff. And I think that what has happened during the process at first, to answer your question more specifically about the value exchange, at first it was much more about, me just kind of going through and giving some critiques because I don't think people, for the most part, knew how to do that. And I'm not saying like I'm best at it. I'm just saying I know how to do it because I've done it a lot. And so I created a guide on the best way to do that. Called it the Art Critique Method. It's a quick little guide of like, asking for a specific type of feedback and going about giving feedback in a certain way so that it's respectful and actually adds value and this sort of thing. Things that I've learned from, doing these things for a long time. And at first it was much more about me kind of going through, like, yeah, I like this works, this doesn't work, maybe think about this and kind of working with people who put in work and doing it that way. But since, the last, I'd say 2 to 3 months or so, a lot of the artists in that space have just like extremely progressed. their abilities, skill sets, world building, all of these things. And it blows my mind, and it makes me proud, if I can say that. It makes me proud to at least have a space where people have like grown into it. Not that they wouldn't have otherwise, but you can see how people like, okay, I took this feedback and I did this, and others are there giving feedback. And for me, it's almost like a classroom of people who are there to learn and share. And then at the end of the day, I also kind of become a student in a way too. And I think we all kind of graduate. And so, the last couple of weeks, we've had several conversations about, sort of the future of the space and what we kind of want to do with it. And then I like to really market heavy, or like, oh, come join my thing. It's not really like that. It's just like, hey, like, here's this thing. If it's valuable for you, so.
Yeah, it's low key and chill.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't want it to be, I think there's a lot of platforms and programs and all this stuff that people are like, oh, come do this thing and spend your entire day here. Otherwise, it doesn't matter for you. And so to me, like, it's really about showing up once a week, throwing a piece in, joining the conversation, give a little bit of feedback here and there. 20 minutes outside of like a live event, a week or something really isn't a huge ask, and just adds value to get perspective from other people. And so to me, there is that kind of exchange. It's like an energy exchange that happens, where I feel like I'm helping people when they tell me that I'm helping them, and they got help from other people just by being there. And that to me is like, never thought I would have something like that. And it's sort of just created itself in a way. It's been very organic, and that's been very valuable to me too.
Let's talk about your work specifically. And I don't know if I'm phrasing this right, but you have a number of collections that fall within the Syncretica moniker, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so will you break down some of those collections and also give us some of the thematic conceptualization or arcs that are important for you to express, and perhaps for people to look for or to glean out of it?
I'll preface it by, I didn't start with this structure in mind or this end goal in mind. And what happened was a very kind of organic process where I had a series last year around this time that I released my first kind of full series, and it was on Object. It was called The Allure of Darkness, and it was, photorealism, sort of what I was alluding to a while ago, and this sort of like dark occulty type of aesthetic, black and white, and really kind of intense, but also very alluring, and it had this sort of mystery to it. And then a lot of it, as I sort of became known for that look and that identity over time, I think people started looking at me as someone who like was into like, dark stuff or Satanism or like things like this. I even had a couple like articles written about me, like, oh, the Satanist black, blah, blah, blah. It's like things like this. And like, that's not who I am. And I sort of countered that with my next series in late December and early January, called The Explorations of Ultra Consciousness. And that tapped into a lot of the things that I've done in my life. I've practiced all different types of things that have sort of broken my understanding of what this reality is, and tapped into and beyond my own consciousness and things like this. And I wanted to kind of represent that part of me as well through the art. And later on, after kind of seeing the two of those, I started working on a series called Penumbra, which is sort of more of a narrative-based story about sort of a traveler that goes through this sort of like dimensional experience, and has this kind of large kind of enlightenment arc of things, like a vulnerability, strip down of ego, and enlightenment type of character arc. And as I was beginning that, I had a conversation with a collector of mine, and we were kind of looking through work, and I was talking about, I fully am aware of how different, these three main things are, like the Allure of Darkness, the exploration stuff, and then this, like, they're all look very different. And his response to me was that he's like, actually, I think they're all within the same world of things. Just hasn't like maybe clicked for you. But when I look at it, I see a full spectrum, dark to light.
Yeah. And also there's a resolution difference in terms of like how close or far some things are. I think when specifically when you are making some scenes there's this kind of grainy aspect. And then when you're getting in nice and close, there's a lot of very organic detail that's occurring. That's just been kind of one of my observations with it.
Yeah. I think even philosophically, like I would say the same thing. You can't really see the forest for the trees, to say it in another way. Like, and so I wanted to understand what that framework might be. So I started to develop a framework around that. Like, what is the dark? What is the light? What is this sort of like powerful path versus an enlightenment path, and things like this. And so I started working with ChatGPT and Poe and others to develop out a framework, like a belief system. And basically the original use case was simply to have different branches that I could produce work off of to make sure that I still, kept a similar core idea around things. And so since starting that, I've just added to it. And a lot of the work that I've done has tapped into that in one way or the other, or I should say maybe branched out from that in one way or the other. I have a series on super rare right now called The Age of Syncretica, and it's with the Strange History Alternative Reality and Sloika group with their Strange History stuff. And I basically created this sort of alternative timeline of like, if this was a real religion, how would that play out? And I tapped into a couple, another older series of mine as sort of like a middle ground point for that, and called False Idols. And I've started building this narrative around the whole thing. And in the middle of doing that, I decided like, well, if I'm gonna really see this through, I need to actually write out what Syncretica actually is as a belief system. And so I began doing that. And so that's sort of an ongoing and probably a very long-term ongoing project for me, is doing that. And so, yeah, hopefully that gives a little bit of insight. There's, 100 different rabbit holes to go down, but that's probably the most succinct way that I could put it.
I would agree. And in terms of having these inversions, right, it's difficult to see light structurally if you don't have these shadow aspects. Are there any things that we have not discussed today that you feel are important for folks that are listening to know about?
I would say anyone in this space that's an artist, we're all sort of trying to do our own thing and build something. And unfortunately, we see a lot of people leave, and it's just the nature of the beast. And I've, definitely have second guessed what I'm doing here and believe in the things that I do. But you're constantly, I think artists tend to be very emotional, and you're tied to your work emotionally is probably the better way I could say that, and the more accurate way. And so it's like, you have this sort of emotional tie to things, and then you have this like real life side of things, and you have like the Twitter world of things. I think all of it can be very overwhelming, and I think that it's okay to feel that way. That's probably the message I would put out there. Like, it's okay to feel that way. I think that we tend to put, I know I personally put a lot of pressure on myself. I think as a community, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and things move real quick. You take a weekend off and your impressions drop 30%. It's that kind of environment where you feel this absolute need to be locked into it all the time. But I think art has never been something that can be rushed. And it can never be something that is truly great. Art can't necessarily have like these super tight deadlines or all this pressure. Like, it's got to come from a place of passion and love or expression in some way, at least love for the work.
Absolutely.
And for me, that's something I'm trying to just hold on to that, while trying not to be distracted or overwhelmed by all the other things. And so maybe that will help someone else realize that, I feel that way too. A lot of other people feel that way too. And it's not something that we speak a lot about. So a little bit of a sprinkle of vulnerability from my side, but it's definitely something that I think, it's tough being here. And I'll wrap that by saying, just believe in what you do, take breaks when you need it. And art is something that will always be there for you, regardless if someone buys it or likes it on the timeline. And that's sort of a byproduct than it is from actually creating it. So,
hey, Black, thank you for taking the time today, and look forward to talking again more in the future.
Absolutely. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot for having me here. It was a pleasure chatting with you.